Welcome to On Our Watch, a podcast about coastal erosion and sustainability in Louisiana, as well as the implications for coastal systems worldwide. My name is Marian Evans. I'm a filmmaker and a producer of the documentary On Our Watch, a feature-length film about Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis. The film's director, Jonathan Evans, and I are proud to produce this podcast series that will continue to explore important coastal issues through conversations with local residents, community leaders, and experts. In this episode, we're speaking with Ramiro Diaz. Ramiro is the Urban Design Director at Waggonner Ball, an internationally active architecture and environment practice based in New Orleans. He is also the leader of Waggonner Ball's Resilience and Living with Water practice. And now, our interview with Ramiro Diaz. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Rami.
Thank you.
Of course. So first I wanted to ask you about what initially drew you to the field of architecture and how you came to work at Waggonner Ball.
So I come from a family of architects. My father's an architect, my mother's an architect, my sister's an architect, grew up in San Francisco, but was drawn to New Orleans because my mom went to Tulane, and that was the connection, family connection, and fell in love with the city and just love being here. So
Awesome.
That's how I got here.
It runs in the family.
Yes, and then I've always been interested in kind of modern architecture, but also historic architecture and renovations, and that was really when I started working at Waggonner Ball. That was the focus of the work, and we then have progressed into kind of urban design and coastal adaptation, resilience work. So
very nice. And so, what would you say your primary focus is in your role as urban design director?
Even though my background is in architecture, I'm very interested in cities. Grew up traveling a lot with my family and seeing different places with them. I also lived in the Netherlands for a year after school, sort of fell in love with that place and got to know it very well. And so I bring to sort of the urban design practice in the firm here this kind of history and interest in cities, but also water systems and landscape. And thinking about design at different scales. I like to build things, I like to work with my hands, but I also like to think about cities as design problems, right? So it doesn't matter the scale, whether you're looking at the whole entire city, the street network, neighborhoods, communities, buildings, doorknobs, cabinetry. To me, it's all kind of a similar approach. And ultimately, as architects, our firm, we see ourselves as facilitators and coordinators. So we really try to work with, whether you're working on a building or you're working with a team of engineers and contractors and sub-consultants, or working in a city, working with the stakeholders at the government level or the community, the neighbors, also the engineering team or the design team. It's all a very similar process that as architects we're trained well to ask good questions and to attack design problems in a collaborative way.
So what do you think is the key to communicating these ideas and concepts effectively to people? And what do you enjoy most about giving those types of talks?
Well, I think creating a narrative that's based around images and vision is really helpful. Just presenting slides of text is going to put people to sleep. And so from the beginning of this kind of advocacy work that we started here at Waggonner Ball after Katrina, it was always like image first, showing history of the place, showing what it used to be, showing what it could be, and really trying to embed the story of what we were trying to communicate into some reality, whether it's the story of the soil or the story of the water that used to be there, which is a lot of the story in New Orleans. We're finding everywhere we work as well that water has memory. It goes back to where it used to be. And when you illustrate to people, this historic fabric of the city grew out of, the water or the place that it is. So New Orleans, for example, we always talk about the river, but also the lake and the Bayou St. John and how the city developed around those patterns. And then you lay on top of that the sort of the plantation spread of, how the city formed along the river with the French urban system, and making maps really beautiful and communicating that way, combined with photographs or paintings, was really how we started the kind of advocacy and building the story about water in New Orleans. it wasn't just about the pipes and the pumps, and it was the whole story. It was how the system developed and looking to the past to look to the future.
Right. So the visual aspect can really help people get it quicker.
Yeah. And so our presentations tend to be, everyone always freaks out at us when we go to give a presentation at a conference or something, because we'll have 75 slides for a 10-minute presentation. And I'm like, I can get through that.
Yeah.
We'll get through that in 10 minutes. It's fine. And because it's much more cinematic,
right?
And much more of a narrative, and not just, put up a slide and talk about it for 10 minutes.
Right.
And so that's really the style that we've evolved in this office, of creating these kind of very heavily graphic and visual presentations.
So can you tell me a little bit about your involvement in the creation of the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan, and how does that plan influence the work that you do today?
Well, it really started with the Dutch dialogues, and David traveling to the Netherlands with people after Katrina. And actually, even earlier, we were involved in every sort of planning exercise that happened, and tried to bring a local and just, of course, heart. It was our place, it was our trauma. We were trying to make something better about our city, and we came up with these visions of a renovated city, rooted in history, rooted in water, looking towards an economic model that would help rebuild the city and provide a business case for the city to be here. And that inspired a lot of people, because it was different from the sort of, we're going to put it back exactly the way it was, or we're going to fix the flood walls. People were asking for more than just the Army Corps response. And so as we were telling the story of the Dutch dialogues and working with people, the people that we had built this network of experts and policy people and people within government, the advocacy for that grew into a application to some grants for HUD sort of disaster resilience planning work. And so we worked with some friends to get this project out there as a real funded project, right? To make the Dutch Dialogues vision into something that was actually paid for, not just volunteer, and so or philanthropic. And so we were able to put together a grant working with the Greater New Orleans Inc., which is actually a business kind of group rather than an environmental group or a planning group. And we put together our team of the Dutch and the American collaborators that have been involved in Dutch Dialogues, and looked at creating a vision for the most heavily impacted parts of the city from Katrina, but also looking forward. So New Orleans East, St. Bernard Parish, Jefferson Parish, and thinking about them collectively and not just parish by parish, right? So St. Bernard Parish and the Lower Ninth Ward are in the same polder, or their kind of water management area. New Orleans East is its own. And we looked at them as like kind of large districts, and then looked for opportunities within to do demonstration projects. So it was about finding projects that could demonstrate the principles of living with water, and an economic kind of model for supporting infrastructure, and a greener, kind of more sustainable approach. So looking at individual kind of projects that are site specific, but also corridors, networks, patterns. For example, we looked at the kind of uptown street network in New Orleans, where you have the high ground at the river, water flows downhill. And we understood that just from this happened the other day with the flooding here, that water backs up against the cross streets.
Yeah.
And the drainage network is there to get it to flow past those impediments and go downhill to the pumps. And so we said, well, what if we took that pattern and turn it into a series of interceptor streets that are cross slope, working with contours, like those kind of rice paddies that you see in Japan, where you see those kind of planes and those lines. And we came up with this strategy to capture water at intersections and then tie that into doing things in parks. And so it was a network approach, but then also, how do you find specific sites? So, for example, the Lafitte Greenway was a corridor, former navigation canal, but also drainage and railroad. And can we do something with that potential project at the time? The Lafitte Greenway hadn't been built yet. turn that into a waterway that could also be a stormwater project. So it was a combination of, can I kayak to the French Quarter from the bayou, but can I also store water? And then the other kind of demonstration project was the Mirabou Water Garden, which is big, huge parcel in Gentilly. And so by identifying projects, but also having a strategy for the whole district, so at all those scales, we were able to come up with a suite of projects. And that strategy has replicated well to other places where you look for opportunities in the landscape. You look for these kind of in-between places, the places where the water wants to go, and find ways to create new kind of networks within the city, whether, it's looking for places for bike trails that can be combined with waterways or greenways that are actually blueways.
Right.
And so we've kind of worked out a methodology for looking at places to start with the soil, start with the watersheds, think about how these watersheds can be districts, and then the districts and the networks and the kind of individual projects that fit within them create a whole picture for a renovation of a city or of a neighborhood.
Okay, so it's like kind of an ongoing thing where some of those projects are still being implemented.
Yeah.
Today.
For sure.
Yeah.
So it was a framework for projects.
Right.
And we identified lots of projects and we only took several of them to that demonstration level. Right. So there are still projects to be found within the city, but we created the framework and the process for identifying those projects.
Awesome. So you mentioned the Mirabou Water Garden, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, what that project is all about and where things stand with that today.
So that was that one is a passion project for us. It came out of the Dutch dialogues initially. One of the sisters, or I think it was an initiate at the Sisters of St. Joseph, which was the convent that was located on that site, was inspired by the Dutch dialogues and found, advocated for using that site, which is 25 acres in Gentilly, to use that for water management and ecological restoration and education. And convinced the Sisters of St. Joseph to dedicate the land to that. And so working with them and then working with the city to find hazard mitigation funding from FEMA to do the project is how it happened. So it's still the sisters' land, but the city has a lease on it to develop this park. And so FEMA gave a grant for developing the project. It is in the urban water plan. It's also in the Gentilly Resilience District funding to do additional programs there, because FEMA is only paying for the water management side of it. There's also a HUD component, which has yet to be designed yet, which involves a lot more community function. So that's the full project. And so there's a pump station that's going to take water out of the Mirabou drainage canal and put it in the site and use the site to store that water. It's a long way from that little pump back to the big, huge pump station, that's pump station number 4. So by managing the water closer to where it falls, we're able to reduce flooding in the larger neighborhood. There's also some gravity intakes at the other side of the site, but we're managing it all there and storing a tremendous amount of water, which will reduce flooding in the neighborhood. It's also a really unique geological condition there. It was the underlying the geology of New Orleans is what's called the Pine Island Trend, which is a barrier island that what is out in the Gulf of Mexico is an island, and then the Mississippi River, when it deposited sediment, covered it up. And so this is a location in the city where that Pine Island Trend barrier island sand is right at the surface. And so we're going to scrape off the clay, which is fairly impermeable, and expose the sand and put better soil and plants and trees and infiltrate the water into that sand, because the sand will infiltrate water where the clay is impermeable. And so that's hopefully when the water comes in from the pump, the little tiny pump station we're putting out there, it'll just go into the ground and then not have to be pumped ever back out to the lake. So hopefully we're holding on to that water forever. That's a pretty cool idea.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's sort of the big idea. And there's a berm around the whole park that we're calling a maintenance path, but it's actually a trail. And so we're using the FEMA kind of logic of, how do you pay for a project to create something that has more benefits for the community?
Right.
So
like a long-lasting benefit.
So it's a trail with some bridges, and then we maintained the mound, the high ground where the sisters' convent was, and that would be a future site for. We don't know yet what it needs to be. There's still another project out there to be developed with the community.
Awesome.
So it's pretty exciting. And then the one last thing is there is a grove of oak trees that are really quite beautiful at the corner, and that's been carved out as a sacred space that is also something to be designed yet, that the sisters want to keep as kind of a sacred place on the site. So it's pretty exciting.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So that's ongoing as well.
It's ongoing. Yeah. It's actually under construction now. So,
okay.
Yeah, yes.
So you've been involved from the beginning, basically?
Yeah, because it was in the Dutch dialogues and then the urban water plan, and been involved with the design of it. And now there's a whole team of people working on it. And so we have other folks in the office that are managing the construction now of that project.
Very cool. So I know that beyond just Louisiana, you're leading several projects around the country, including in Norfolk, Virginia. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience working there and what is unique about that region in particular.
So Virginia was another Dutch dialogues story. We were asked by the community there to do a Dutch dialogues in Virginia. It was during the period of the 100 Resilient Cities program, Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities, and they had a new chief resilience officer, and she really wanted to work with the communities around to do this Dutch dialogues process. She saw the success in New Orleans, the urban water plan, and so we worked with them, with the regional planning group there to put on another Dutch dialogues. And so we brought together a lot of our familiar friends from the Netherlands, as well as local architects and landscape architects and planners, to hold a fantastic workshop in Norfolk. We looked at Norfolk and Hampton. Hampton is a community on the north side of the James River, and Norfolk. And out of that, a whole stream of work kind of developed, and projects. We identified projects in Norfolk, as well as Hampton, and they were really looking at how do we defend our city from storm surge. And they basically didn't want to be another New Orleans, exactly, right? So that by building a wall around themselves, a levee around themselves, how do you not avoid the mistakes that happen in New Orleans?
Right.
And so while the Dutch dialogues wasn't looking at the wall specifically, in some places we were trying to fold it into the landscape. But we were really excited by the Norfolk filled in all their creeks in downtown, and built on top of them. And so there was this real obvious pattern of this historic creek network.
Yeah.
Infilled it, and it's exactly where all the flooding problems are happening. And they had built public housing on top of this former creek. And so it was a real sort of, back in the 30s or 40s. And it was a real opportunity to redevelop a huge part of the city. So we sketched that during the Dutch dialogues. It's then turned into the National Disaster Resilience Competition work, which included the St. Paul's district, which is where this creek was, and then another historic community that was at risk to coastal storm surge and other kinds of flooding. HUD granted them $140 million, I believe it was, $120 million, to do the Ohio Creek watershed project, which was basically a multi-phase function project: stormwater protection, storm surge protection, living shoreline, as well as internal stormwater management. So a real model for what could be developed for the whole entire city, in a small neighborhood that was disadvantaged and low income, moderate income. And there was also public housing. So HUD was like, great project.
Yeah.
It was cut off the freeway. When they built the freeway, they cut off the neighborhood. And so part of the project was reconnecting the neighborhood to the city, and then building this protection system in a way that, unlike New Orleans, where there was not kind of a community function for the stormwater protection, storm flood protection, We built the levees and really worked with the community to try to make them not an impact on their houses and their views of the river. The living shoreline protects from the waves from the boats going by, but also creates habitat and oyster reefs. We were able to put a fishing pier as part of the project, and then stormwater parks that manage the stormwater coming through the watershed, and then a pump station to pump it out, because you do need a pump, but made that a resilience hub and a resilience center so that it was kind of a beacon in the neighborhood. So really cool project with all the components, and street, doing infrastructure in the street, corner bump outs and bioswales, and combined that with pervious paving, and it was just kind of all the suite of the projects that were in the urban water plan for New Orleans. We were able to get them into a neighborhood and use that experience, and Norfolk built it. It's done. It's finished. The whole project is done now.
That's cool how we can learn from each other.
Exactly. Yeah. And then now we're working on the full protection alignment with the city. We're working for the city as the non-federal sponsor for the Army Corps project. And so we're kind of have this interesting dialogue back and forth with, trying to address the needs of the community. The Army Corps has their process. We're trying to influence it. Some parts of it are already in kind of construction documents. Other parts are still very conceptual. But it's an interesting project to watch and be involved in. And then the other half of the Dutch Dialogues project, even though it wasn't funded by HUD, the city has found other funding for it. So we're also working on that, which is to daylight this creek and bring it back. And so where the creek is going to be the front door to the redeveloped neighborhood. They've torn down all the public housing that was in the floodplain. They're building a new mixed income, kind of mixed use neighborhood that fronts onto this historic restored creek. And that's going to work in conjunction with the new the flood wall, to manage stormwater internally, so that they don't have to pump as much when they do have the flood wall there eventually. So
that all sounds very exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rami, for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This is exciting work that's happening around the country and here as well. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to On Our Watch. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Ramiro Diaz. Don't forget to subscribe to On Our Watch on your favorite podcast app to be notified about future episodes. You can find our feature-length documentary On Our Watch, as well as a video version of today's episode, in the links below. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back with another episode next week. This podcast is made possible through support from the Greater New Orleans Foundation and executive produced by Bruno UK Steiner.